Welcome back. We're on to episode 2 of Unhinged with David and Stu.
Hi there, I'm Stu Rochelle.
And I'm David. The last podcast was so successful that we decided to do another one.
If you can bear it, folks, we're going to carry on.
Exactly. No one's going to silence me, not even AOC, that lazy piece of garbage.
Oh, you've calmed down just a bit. Piece of garbage. I think that's the best you've ever spoken of her.
Really?
I'm good.
I thought it was rather appropriate for a woman who calls herself a socialist and shows up at the Met Ball and with all the wealthy celebrities. Damn hypocrite she is.
Well, the change of her outfits and her whole posture now that she's become, more affluent, more upscale, She was just kind of a bedraggled little girl who was out there, and then now she's no longer the guerrilla fighter.
She'll be on the cover of Vogue just with Dr. Jill Biden, who is no doctor. But let's before I go on a digression, I wanted to thank the individual who created the artwork for this.
Please.
Clara Wong. She is a dear friend of the family and a creative genius, obviously.
Thanks, Clara.
She also was a good friend of my daughter and went to that horrible private school, Avenue's the worst school, with my daughter.
Thanks for the plug at the school, yeah right?
And it remains not worth the money, trust me.
I'll give you a little later. I'll give you his precise address and email and all other data so you can really harass him on that one school.
Okay, but in addition, we're resuming this little discussion right after Independence Day. And it makes me think that right next to me is someone who served his country in Vietnam, came back, didn't throw his medals over a fence, was humble about it, didn't act like he was some big war hero, like that piece of garbage down in Washington, D.C., John Kerry, who's a gigolo and a scumbag, who went to Vietnam, manufactured his injuries to get Purple Hearts, and they got himself sent back. He is the worst scumbag ever, and he ran for president against a beatable incumbent who got us involved in a crazy war and lost. That's how bad he is. And you think, back to those days, those guys were luminaries compared to what we have now. But that all said, on Independence Day here in New York City, I went to the beach. It was a very lovely day. We come back. We go out to dinner to Peter Luger's in Brooklyn. As I mentioned, I do every now and then like to venture into that outer borough and experience.
Only with an armed guard, as I understand.
Because I'm not worried about all those hippie loser trust. But that's another issue. But while you're getting into the Uber, I don't use public transportation like you, Stuart, who gets involved.
We're working on them.
We're working on you. You'll be driving a Mercedes. But that all said, while I'm getting in the Uber, I noticed down in Washington Square Park, there's all these pro-Hamas demonstrators marching and complaining about Gaza on our Independence Day. It's a disgrace. These people, if they did the same march in Iran, they'd be executed, jailed, and beaten.
You're right.
And they are ignorant of the Middle East and what's going on there. Not like I'm an expert, don't get me wrong, but what I do know is if you're running around causing rabble-rousing, you'll be executed in Saudi Arabia. And we also know that Arabs live a better life in Israel than they do in Iran. And if any of these lit-tard morons want to go and live in Iran and experience it, they should go and then come back and talk about how terrible the Israeli go.
And doing it on a day and doing it in places, I mean, it was in Washington Square. I think it was in Washington, D.C. I think many places. Doing it on that day is particularly hurtful and ignorant. Don't go after a nation and, again, something it believes in so deeply. And I have to add something now, because those bastards in the park in Washington Square, I noticed the other day I was in there. I wander through there all the time. They graffitied the place. They graffitied one of the sides of the Washington statue again. This was done during Black Lives Matter and all this other stuff during the pandemic. But I didn't notice it until I started leaving the park, walking north toward the arch, and I was sickened again. I only hope someone had some video of this stuff. Of the good guys had some video, and can get something to these folks, get something to the cops about these folks, get the bastard who graffitied this or the several folks, and do something. Arrest, prosecute, convict, and send them to prison. It just sickened me when I saw that. It's a noble statue, a noble arch, and it's significant in itself. And doing this without that protest, without regard to our feelings as a nation, is disgusting.
Well, it's a reflection of those people and their values and their lack of education. They probably went to Avenue's the worst school, where they were schooled in hatred of America while paying $60,000 a year for tuition. But at that all said, for them to be graffitiing statues on our Independence Day to the father of our country, if they were in Iran or Saudi Arabia, they'd have their hands chopped off at the very least. And I wish they would be, because they deserve it.
Look, some of these folks are probably just students who haven't got much of an idea about anything and are out to protest and can be convinced of anything. Followers very easily. I don't know. And oh, by the way, a lot of these people must have been wearing face gear in addition to the hijab, which goes around the head. And that raises just an odd subject, which comes up periodically in New York City about a potential requirement for not wearing such facial masks in public. That's been raised a couple of times, but
by our esteemed governor, Kathy Hochul,
the mayor, and even one of the ladies on the city council has been forgotten, Moore or something, or Mom Morin or something like that. Yeah, well, but no. In this case, she's the one who wanted to put it forth, and then she was exiled from the city council on educational subjects. I thought that was an interesting twist, and of course, this would be very difficult to enforce. And I'm just saying, but it's raised by that very kind of activity where people are hiding from the acts they commit.
Protesters who graffiti national monument.
And it goes on. I mean, that mask thing is now getting a lot of attention because of the guys on e-bikes that are going in and robbing. I'm sure you've seen something lately on that. There was that one where they went into a restaurant in the East Village the other. And so that, I'm sure they had stuff over their face. That isn't a matter of religious conviction. You know, you can get a Muslim approach to that answer, but you get a black guy on an e-bike, that's a different story.
Well, I don't know whether the color on the bike is the color of the person, but I do know most of those demonstrators in Washington Square Park are probably from affluent families covering their faces so that when they apply for jobs, Goldman Sachs, they don't want to be blacklisted by Bill Ackman, who is, and all these other investment bank and hedge fund crew who have blackballed these people at Harvard and other schools who've been engaging in what can only be described as an outburst of anti-Semitism. And once again, I can honestly say I am not a big fan of the government of Israel, and there's a lot to be said about it. But there is something even worse about ignorant college students and others like them marching around calling for basically the genocide of Jews. It's disgraceful. They are the most repulsive people out there, and they are a bedrock of the progressive wing of the Democrat Party who have supported them. That we were already referring to AOC. She was at Columbia during those demonstrations, sashaying around. Probably got dropped off in her BMW to go do it, as was Ilhan Omar, and her slut daughter was thrown out of school for her protesting and anti-Semitism. And the list is endless. And then we also have the very enjoyable defeat of Jamal Bowman in Westchester, who also embraced the anti-Semitic Democrat Party line and got booted. And he did it in a district where there are a lot of Jewish people, which isn't all that smart as well. And he was a school principal. This is who is educating our kids. And no wonder they're all like, they can't. I mean, that's even worse than the headmaster at Avenue's the worst school.
Let me give you another take on this, not on the stuff in Washington Square, but on the Muslim hijab kind of thing and the way Muslims are performing or acting these days in public. I walked into Trader Joe's the other day, and as I went down the path inside the building toward the entry to the main, that's 14th Street, Union Square, and I was about to enter the produce area, And there was a woman, kind of security-like, though not wearing a badge. She had a hijab on the head thing, no face covering, but a garb, otherwise black garb. But as I'm about to walk by her, a guy brushes past her and comes past me, and he is screaming. And he's saying, "You were following me. You were following me. You're a no-good Jew. You're a no-good Muslim. God damn it. I'm a Jew. I'm of the chosen people." And he was screaming and threatening. I said, "Look, you're causing a problem. Get out of here." And he eventually went out without further confrontation. But I felt very bad. I got to tell you, I felt very bad for the lady that she was being subjected to this. Reflexively, I put my hand on her shoulder. I don't know if that was a violation of, their male contact, but it was instinctive, and I just wanted to comfort her. And she was very appreciative, and she thanked me for it. But that's just a little tweak in the other direction. A woman trying to make it in the commercial world in a decent way, and some wacko, and that's all I could think of, treated her that way. I just want to throw that in as a counterpoint.
Well, I mean, it's further reflection with someone wearing their religious gear for legitimate reasons, as opposed to people who are wearing it to cover up their faces because they're embarrassed to be caught protesting something they supposedly believe in. There's a big difference. And that is why the draconian policy of eliminating masks altogether is probably not the best idea. But what do you expect out of a state that's run by Kathy Hochul and that Alvin Bragg and the rest of them? And we also know that you were talking about these protesters and how they should be jailed and prosecuted and arrested. Well, he wouldn't even prosecute them if he wanted to. He basically has spent millions of dollars going after, big fat orange Donald Trump. And, but, we did get a conviction, which was surprising to me, but he did get it. And I will give him credit for that because I like the fact that Donald Trump has a stain, although he already has enough stains, including the spray tan. But then for the Columbia protesters who held someone hostage at the Hamilton Hall, he let them most of them off. He said there wasn't enough evidence. And he did the same thing. I'm not sure if this was him. I think it may have been during the BLM looting and rioting, where a lot of the people were not prosecuted because, quote unquote, they didn't have enough evidence. No, this is just part of his policy of selective prosecution.
I was out on the street. You mentioned during the BLM stuff. During the pandemic, the looting started. And I was out on the street one morning. We live in Greenwich Village. And I was out on, the next street down from Fifth Avenue to the East, University Place. And it was about 7 a.m. There weren't many people out there, but it was a night after a lot of activity, I'll say, at Union Square. Thousands and thousands of people is there protesting, yelling, screaming, and there were cops there. I looked on University, and I turned my head to the left, to the north, toward the park, and I saw the hulks of 2 or 3 burned out police cars. And I went up there, and the next day I realized I saw that there were videos of the way these protesters, were not just passively standing there yelling about their cause, but they were surrounding the police cars. And this really wasn't picked up or emphasized by the networks. They were compressing themselves against the vehicle. Those guys in that car were were in a situation of great risk. And so what they did was slowly move forward, because that was the only exit they have, with their car, and moved out without any harm to anyone. But the pictures show them as being some offensive weapon. And they weren't using an offensive weapon. They're trying to save their lives from an unruly mob.
Well, that whole riot stuff that went on, we heard how they were peaceful demonstrators, that it was white supremacists who were doing the looting, that it was, blah, blah, blah. That was all a lie. A lie of the left. The left wing in this country has lost their marbles ever since they never had marbles to begin with, but when Donald Trump came along, they lost all consideration of rationality, and to justify that kind of behavior is disgraceful. And who was in the middle of the BLM protests and got arrested for it? Meanwhile, at the same time, this horrible child who's raised by that disastrous Mayor DeBlasio She used the police to move her belongings into Gracie Mansion. She used the cops to protect her and drive her around. And then she's in the middle of these protests and had her mugshot on the cover of the New York Post. She looked like she was high. She looked disgraceful. And her name is Clara DeBlasio. And she is part of a disgusting family. And the next day, when this whole came to fruition that she was arrested for protesting the cops she used to protect her and help her move, he was on the news going, "I'm so proud of my daughter." Now, if that was my daughter, I would jump out a window in shame. Obviously, she's on drugs again, needed to get into rehab. If you looked at the picture of her glazed eyes, that was definitely some.
And where is he now, Mr. de Blasio?
Oh, he's in Brooklyn. Brooklyn, him and his wife are separated now, and he's dating other people. But you made me digress, Stuart. I must say, while he was mayor of New York City, he did so many different things to New York City to make it unpleasant to live here, one of which was lessen the fines for urinating on the streets.
One of your pet subjects.
Okay, it's outrageous. Imagine allowing this. Now people are doing all kinds of things on the streets. Well, de Blasio needs this to be taken home. He lives in Park Slope. I cannot give out his address, but I encourage every New York City citizen to go to his house in Park Slope and do your business right in front of his house so he can smell what the rest of us have.
You know, you've created an update segment by doing this, because you mentioned this in our initial episode. And that's a good thing that we should follow up on. If we have something that is an ongoing story, we just pick up on it.
Well, I'm okay for updating it. And speaking of updates, speaking of this dysfunctionally run city, we have the bus depot. Let me just mention that whole nightmare. Now the city has said, we can do whatever we want, or the MTA, we can do whatever we want. We're still putting it out there, but we'll move it 20 feet away from your entrance. And, you know, they have the right, like they're almost, I don't even get the way they run things. It's like a Kafka book. But once again, this has been months now, and they've done nothing. Because that's what we get out of the city. We're going to do something and do nothing. Not even a bus depot can they.
Well, let's not push them into action.
Well, I don't think we'll have to worry about it, because truthfully, they're so inefficient and incompetent. They make the Italian government look functional. No, and in terms of the whole thing, it's a nightmare. But what else? Well, this is what New York has become. Although there are worse cities than this, believe it or not. Look at San Francisco and what's happened there. But anyway, Stuart, I think you have something
I want to tell a little story. This is now I'm drifting.
It's Mr. Rogers. Let's go. I'll get you a card again.
There's a lady that now deceased that I learned something about, and we'll start by saying she was born in 1751. And in her early years, there was an Indian attack. She lived in either Pennsylvania or New York. I don't recall which, and I'm not sure the records show it clearly. And her father was killed by an Indian raid, and her mother was dragged away, and she was never seen again. That's the beginning of this woman's tough life. In 1722, she meets a guy, marries a guy. In 1770, where is it now? In 1776, this guy goes off into the Continental Army after the Revolutionary War had begun. She follows him, as many other parents did and wives did, in what they called a camp follower, although these days I know it as only being a hooker at a mining camp or the like. But she goes off, and where does she end up? That unit gets called up to Fort Washington. Oh, and her work, and she worked. She was a nurse-like person, and so she helped with medical aid. She cleaned, she washed clothing, and cooked, as many others did. So they end up at Fort Washington, which was essentially right under the George Washington Bridge, where it stands now. She ends up helping her husband as the Hessian soldiers came ashore, and firing a cannon. He dies. She takes up the cannon and performs his work and correctly and boldly in accordance with according to some other reports. She gets severely injured. She gets captured by the British. she's released in kind of a very humane way that I haven't heard of before, in which your enemy releases you so that you can go back to your own medical facilities. That sounds practical as well, but a moral thing that I don't think is followed often. And she dies eventually, but not until after she had been given a military pension, the first woman to get a military pension because of the action she took. Fast forward to 1926, and the DAR, a bastion of those who were first here or watched the first ones who got off the boat or whatever that is all about.
The Daughters
of the American Revolution. They decide, along with West Point, that this woman ought to be buried at West Point because of all the good things she did. And I think that was a good idea. This woman deserves credit for all she did. And so, okay, so there's a burial at West Point. Fast forward again to 2016. I read of some disturbance, the DAR said, at the gravesite, possibly injuring the headstone. And as a result of that, somehow, there was a detailed forensic study of the bones of the deceased. Lo and behold, it turns out it wasn't this lady. It was a guy. And so the lady, whose name is Margaret Corbin, we still don't know where Margaret is, but the final chapter for now, I won't call it the final chapter, but I was wandering around through Greenwood Cemetery, which is a wonderful place for many reasons, and I stumble upon a tablet explaining a few of the things that I've just said. Nothing, I don't think they said anything about the inaccurate burial. And then it had a casket made of some resin of some kind. It wasn't stone. And it stood out because it was pinkish. And maybe not the final replacement for this. But I think that woman is worthy of praise. And the fact that she's now up at about the highest point in Greenwood Cemetery, which was where the Battle of Brooklyn was largely fought, I think that's wonderful. But the idea that West Point and the DAR both made a mistake as to who they buried there, there's something about which I'm sure they're quite embarrassed.
Well, I'm sure that's very consistent with the way things have always run in certain ways. But Stuart, is this what you do on your free time? You wander around cemeteries looking for headstones?
I think wandering through Greenwood Cemetery is a magical place for so many reasons, and it's hilly. So those of you who like hiking and like walking aggressively, I mean, it's a good spot, and it's convenient by train, the N train to 25th Street in Brooklyn. Oh, no, it's a wonderful...
Why don't you go somewhere?
I do.
Go to a pool. Why are you going to a cemetery?
I see. Well, don't worry. We'll get you there.
No, the only place you're getting me is the Four Seasons, someplace like that, where I could be waited on and served. I have no interest. But as far as your story, well, I'm glad she has an acknowledgement in Brooklyn, no less, my favorite place. And I'm glad that you told me this little story. And what it brings to mind is,
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, we didn't really get to this topic, and maybe we will a little further along, but, it sounds like the people who buried her are a little demented, like our president, who can't even carry on a conversation. Yet, according to him and his aides, it was because he traveled too much. It's because he had a cold, blah, blah, blah.
He's tired.
Maybe he's tired. Well, if you're tired, get the hell out of there. And number two, I heard they had 10 medical experts in Parkinson's disease visiting the White House. Now, why was that? Were they there to try to investigate?
What are your sources for this stuff?
I was in the New York Times, Stuart.
That's one source, yeah.
And I mean, a lot of people will claim the New York Times is a criminal organization.
No.
But, I mean, they're reporting about their favorite son, Mr. Joe,
right there
from the bottom of his class from an undistinguished law school, that it's got to be true. It's got to be true.
I expect there's a lot of merit there, and other people are failing to come forth with their true feelings about the wisdom of his continued candidacy.
No, I mean, anyone who makes Donald Trump look sane and rational, as he did during that debate, is definitely not in the position to be president of the United States. No wonder why we have had the Ukrainian situation, the embarrassing withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the Israeli conflict, it's all happened under his watch because he is weak, he is inept, and may I quote one of my favorite quotes from Barack Obama, which he rumored to have said about Joe Biden, don't underestimate his ability to F things up. He has a very good job in that regard, and anyone who tells me he has been a good president is ridiculous. But I think now that I have finished this very brief critique of Joe Biden, the plagiarist, the liar, the buffoon, I think we're about to conclude this second episode. But before I do want to encourage people, if you have anything you want to say to us or you want to suggest, you can email us at davidandstuunhinged@gmail.com, and we will put in a link in the description as well so you see it, and we will be in touch soon with another episode. Thank you.